Hello and welcome to the Baker Estate Library and Archives. I am pleased to announce that I will be your host for today's story. As per the wishes of my organization, you may refer to me as the author. It is a collective goal at the Baker Estate to locate and preserve stories as well as write new ones. Stories are told, retold, embellished, minimized, altered, and in the worst cases, forgotten. It is the hope of I and my dedicated staff that we can create an expansive wealth of literary knowledge. In recent history, the Baker Estate preferred to research only things relating to the occult and dark magics, but we've moved beyond this narrow scope with the addition of our newest sponsor, who prefers to be referred to as the benefactor. These changes have allowed us to expand and open up to the public in the hopes that we can not only share these stories with you, but that we can receive new ones in our archives as well. To accompany these stories, there will be a relating image handcrafted by our apprentice. The artistic work will be displayed at the end of the reading for you to enjoy while we accept questions from the audience. Near the back of the room, there is a table with light refreshments, a rack to store extra coats, and copies of this month's program events. Please feel free to utilize these amenities at your leisure during the reading. To begin our first presentation, I will relay a favorite of our generous benefactor to thank them for allowing us this new opportunity. Please settle in. We will begin shortly. The Immortal Writer. To preface, this reading is a combination of dubious fact, second to third hand accounts, and a dragon's hoard worth of books written over a vast period of time. True, there are several credible sources that mention the Immortal Writer and his escapades, but all history is written by the collective perspectives of biased individuals. We must take these entries with a grain of sugar. Many people have put thought into being immortal at least once. To live forever. To have the time to travel the world, read every book, visit every wonder, and still find the time to achieve your goals. But something that isn't always considered are the negative effects of living so long. Yes, I'm sure we consider the hundreds of years that some species live as immortal, but I'm talking about being truly immortal, unkillable, unchanging, never being able to lay to rest once the world you know and love is gone, having to adapt to the rapidly developing and inconsistent changes in the world around you. The assurance of everlasting life may seem desirable, but it had become a curse in the eyes of the Immortal Writer. It is unclear how he became immortal. Even the man himself seems to have forgotten, as it appears living so long can cause you to forget more than one might expect. It is believed that he even forgot his original name, simply calling himself the Immortal Writer. His attempts near the end of his life to recall his name failed, due to the mere inconvenience of being born as a creature with an average lifespan of 90 or so years. His mind was only built to handle so much information, that when he surpassed this threshold, the grip on his native tongue was reduced until nothing was left. His chosen moniker made his travel and introductions more simplified, particularly as he had begun to gain reputation. Playing as a guest to many a great house or lord, the Immortal Writer's presence became a status symbol. To the upper crust of society in the country of Loranda, for example, it was seen as an enviable position to be included in his works. Had the publishing traditions of today been in practice some 850 years ago, then the writer's subsequent exile from Loranda may have been avoided. You see, when a book was written, very few copies were made at the time, as this was prior to the various printing methods of today being widely available. The Immortal made a practice to create 1 to 3 copies of each book during this period of his life, but not all copies were equal in content. He would present the hosting family with a flatteringly highlighted version of their interactions, stories, and various related tales he collected. He would sometimes have a second copy of this version made, but in every instance the writer would make a different version he would keep to himself. This version would include every truth and secret that he experienced, witnessed, or heard tell of. One of the prominent families had a daughter, Ariel Leshaw, who was keenly aware of the Immortal Writer. She had requested to read many of his works, delighted with the impressive prose and attention to detail. Where it all went wrong, as good things tend to do, was during the exchange of these books. The Immortal Writer was not unaware of what would happen if the more truthful accounts were exposed. Careful planning was taken to ensure that these books would remain in his private collection at his home. But a series of simple mistakes and lack of oversight began the events leading up to his execution. A new head of staff at his home had been hired. Last-minute changes to the date and time of a dinner party at an affluent client's estate. The misunderstanding of which collection of books Ariel was allowed to borrow from. A lack of protest from her that this was not the library she was usually taken to. All of this combined with the false sense of security that was brought on after years of not even a hiccup during the borrowing of his books. Still silent, Ariel quickly made her way home with the incorrect books and learned more than any court gossip could have dreamed of. The young woman understood the profound advantage she had just gained. These were not merely rumors. These were the first-hand accounts of the lifestyle and behaviors of the upper elites. The writer had been invited into their homes, villas, and keeps, where he did what he was renowned for. He wrote. She read on the affairs, the shady dealings, the absurdities, and the scandalous behavior that had been recorded. Afterward, for an undetermined amount of time, Ariel gathered knowledge and quickly climbed the social ladder. Her swift advancement did not go unnoticed and was promptly questioned. Her reign only lasted so long before letting slip where she was gathering this information. The pressures and subtle threats stemming from her blackmail had become too much. The investigation of the Immortal Writer had begun. Other than noted testimony, not much else is known of what became of Ariel. The writer's home was raided and his books seized. In what seemed to be such a short portion of an immortal life, the writer had fallen from the heights of societal appreciation to being reviled and branded as a traitor. He was brought to trial over his work, accused of trespassing, libel, and recording secrets of noble families with the intention to extort them. We have procured a portion of the court notes for the trial in our research, which I am happy to share with you. The 5th day of the 7th month of the 50th year, the accused has pled not guilty, stating he was under no contract to exclude particular information, nor has he lied in any of his accounts. He has also stated that these accounts were to remain in his personal collection, that he had no intentions of publishing or sharing these works. Against the evidence of the court that has been submitted, the testimony taken, and by the victims represented, he is judged as guilty of his crimes and sentenced to death. His works are to be burned and any copies seized. So saith the High Court of Loranda. Unfortunately, this was all that was recovered and translated, though we are hopeful to find more official documents related to this court case. For the remaining account, we rely on speculative journal entries and newsprints from various publications at the time. The following passage comes from a journal entry of a guard who was present during the execution. It is said that when the writer was taken to hang in the square for his crimes, he proved how truthful he and his accounts were. He wouldn't die. In their astonished rage, the executioners took to extreme measures. His neck was snapped, his throat was cut, his body beaten, and then finally, his head severed. It rolled down the steps of the gallows and onto the pavement. The eyes looked around, not frantically, but keenly, observing the crowd, taking in all the details while the body stood upright, trundled past the guardsmen who stood stock still in astonished horror, and plucked the head from the ground. With a sickening wet noise, the head was reattached, and the man was whole again. He who had never lied was truly the Immortal Writer. It is unclear what occurred after this moment, though. Different accounts tell us that there was a panic in the crowd, some screaming accusations of devilry towards the writer, and, curiously, accusations of a false trial. What is understood is that there was chaos in the crowd, and that the Immortal Writer was able to use it as an opportunity for his escape. He hurried home, gathered as many books as he could, and fled the country of Loranda. Before long, word spread that the Immortal Writer was now in exile from the country. As they couldn't kill him, they told him he wasn't welcome back. Over the next several years he kept his head down, changing names each time as he entered a new place and avoided notoriety. Still, he kept writing. Each time he filled a book, he stored it in a property he owned. The wealth he had earned was not insignificant, nor was the amount he was able to smuggle out of Loranda. Another benefit of immortality was that he no longer truly needed to eat or sleep. This led to far fewer expenses during travel. There were attempts to settle down, but each move, Each new home, each new life he had to adopt brought him further and further into despair. For each time he carved out a moment of peace, he was forced to reflect upon the history of his life, or at least what he could remember. Frighteningly, the amount of years he could remember was getting shorter. These gaps, these missing pieces in the complicated and unfinished puzzle unsettled him. Who was he? A writer? A man? What drove him to write? Had he ever loved anyone? Had anyone ever loved him? Had he loved the thing that spoke to him in the back of his mind? Had it loved him when it forced this everlasting hell on him? Pardon me. I lost my train of thought for a moment. Where were we? Yes. In the years after his exile, the Immortal Writer traveled far and wide, but nothing would match the comfortable life he had been forced to leave behind. Each new home, each new life dulled his desire to continue his craft. On the 12th year of his sporadic journey, he made a decision. His new home was empty of books. It was empty of parchment, quills, ink, and anything else that would allow him to write or even read. A small cottage on a hill that overlooked the village nearby, he lived as a hermit, tending to a small garden and chickens, rarely venturing into town. It was somewhat peaceful for the first year. He took up many other hobbies to fill his time: sewing, wood carving, and doting upon the chickens he had grown to care for, his favorite being the gray-feathered one he had named Bella. He soon began to believe that he may be able to remain here and settle his soul, that the itch under his skin would recede, and that the pressure behind his eyes would lessen, that the thought of turning one of those stray feathers into a quill would cease, that the growing visions would stop. Whispers in the night, demands for more stories, a dark shadow with a white mouth screaming at him for more. This carried on for days, each vision more horrifying than the last. For the first time in possible centuries he'd lived, he felt as though he might die, that his very soul was at stake. He who had lived longer than any of his kind, he who had survived being executed. It was nearly laughable. Surely those down in the village believed that there was now a ghost haunting his cottage, for his screams of terror and hysterical cackling would have frightened any and all away who had come to investigate. When finally the writer awoke from his most recent bout of dazed madness, he found that he had written a story. The furniture of his home had been smashed to the corners of the room, the paintings and wall hangings torn to shreds. In their place were words written in red, descriptions of terrible things that had plagued him in his visions. His hands were covered in blood, and his robes in gray feathers. He dropped to his knees in awe and terror of his work. He had grown so fond of those chickens. In his self-isolation they had become his companions, the protectors of his garden, and one of the few things that still brought a smile to his face. But in his madness, the only value that they held was their blood that he had used for ink. After shaking off the shock of the situation, he washed his hands, changed his clothes, and ignored the tears streaming down his face while he set fire to the cottage. Whatever force that was causing him to write these stories was hungry and in need of new material. The fear of its wrath was so great he began to wander once more, fresh empty pages, and new metal writing implements. While he would forget why, in time, he felt wary of ever using a feather quill again. Walking along every path that had been carved into the land, and even creating his own, he deposited his finished work in every place he stayed. The urge to keep moving was strong, and rather than spend a few weeks to a month in a single village as he used to, he now spent mere days. Enough to gather a story and write it down before moving on. Throughout the next years on the road, he met countless individuals of all types, exchanging stories with them like currency. It became dull. Where he would have once dreamt of a life like this, he now loathed every moment of it. There was no connection to be had. Becoming more and more apathetic as he felt compelled to continue his wretched journey, it was only the fear of the visions returning that pressed him forward, all the while stripping him of what little humanity he had left. Eventually, the abject terror he felt about slipping into a maddened rage became too much. Instead of merely requesting a story to trade, the writer began to travel to areas that were not only dangerous, but would be deadly to anyone else. Pushing the limits of his immortality, he set forth to explore the world's darkest and most dangerous corners, and write about every single one of them. The deepest caves, filled with little-known horrors, the darkest woods, which held creatures so old that he was nothing but a child to them. The writer traversed ruins of old castles said to be so haunted that no one else would survive a night. He hunted beasts that terrorized villages if only to describe their teeth as he was devoured. Each adventure gave him fresh material to write about, but it also drove him further down the spiral of madness. He became a husk of his former self, not that he would really know it. His desperate behavior won him no favor or friends in the few villages he visited, and even led him to being tossed into a cell more than once. These, albeit brief, instances of isolation shook the writer deeply, his fear so great that the jailers had become convinced he was insane. Before long, he was admitted to a sanatorium, where he spent the better part of 3 months trying to convince them to let him go. When it became clear that they would not allow him to leave, he prepared to escape. During his time locked away, he had learned that while physical bindings worked on him, the various medications that he had been administered lasted for only so long before dissipating. Biding his time, he was able to secure a large and lethal dose of a sedative commonly used on the patients. Waiting until just before the final evening check, he plunged the needle into his heart, hoping that it would wear off before he awoke in a coffin underground. The staff entered the room, found the body, and unknowingly pronounced the Immortal Writer dead. When consciousness rushed back into his body, the Immortal Writer found himself wrapped in a sheet and unceremoniously held in a wheelbarrow. Wriggling free and jumping up, he paid no mind to the scream let out by the gravedigger who had been preparing the new plot. Finally free, the writer ran to one of the few places he had yet to explore. During all the time he spent in the sanatorium, he could hear the lapping waves of the ocean from his room. There were many stories to be told of voyages across the water and monsters below the depths, but he was ready to write about the things no one else had ever experienced. He made his way to a high cliff that held a large drop onto craggy spires that protruded from the ocean below. He had tested his ability to hold his breath before and came to the conclusion he no longer needed to breathe. With no hesitation in his heart, he resolved to sink into the depths. He leapt from the cliff. The salted wind ripped at his skin while he descended. Before thought could be put to the intensity of the descent, the writer was speared and smashed upon the rocks. At this point in his madness, physical pain meant little. He felt the burning sensation of rocks cutting into his flesh and organs, but the need to slip into the water was stronger. Ripping himself free, and caring not for the pieces of him left behind, he sunk into the deep. While a ship can cross an ocean in weeks to months, a single man walking on the ocean floor will take years to make it to the other side. The depths hold many unseen beauties, but it also holds just as many horrors. Things with far too many teeth, long-reaching tentacles, and the deep echoing bellows of things too hideous to leave the dark. He bore witness to them all, and was nearly eaten by many. More than once he had to claw his way out of a beast's stomach. It's unclear how long he spent in the water, but it's estimated that it took nearly 7 years to cross. The few writings that have been recovered were runes scratched into rocks, whale skins, and several elaborately carved seashells. These cryptic accounts are still being researched and translated. Once the writer returned to dry land, there was a change in him. A plethora of hurried and frantic books were written, as though he was trying to spill his memories on the page before he lost them. It was clear through his writing that what little sanity he had retained was finally slipping away. The languages and dialects used in these later accounts vary, and there have been many attempts to unravel the story. Throughout all the ramblings, there was one clear theme: self-destruction. The writer began a series of research, reports of various creatures and beasts invited to bite, sting, and scratch, each documented and the various effects studied. Experiments involved vivisection, leeching, live surgeries, attempts at regenerating anything from bone marrow to brain matter. The Immortal Writer had come to finally write about the greatest mystery of his long miserable life. How immortal was he? He had pushed the bounds past what any other mortal being could, had explored the places no one else would dare, had survived more than any could imagine. And yet, he still lived. Some of the final reports that had been discovered were written with surprising clarity, a last spark of sanity before the end. The accounts are as follows. The 2nd day of the 9th month. My long journey has amounted to nothing, or so I thought. After one too many failed experiments, I felt the threads of my mind snap. The next thing I was aware of was a hollow feeling in my face, and the sticky sensation of blood. I looked at the round, blood-slick object in my hand, and found my own eye looking back at me. I waited for the familiar tickle of her growing flesh, but it did not come. My vision remained halved, and the wound continued to bleed. Out of curiosity, I pushed the eye back into its orifice, but again, nothing occurred. Fascinating. Scooping the eye back out, I placed it into the only container I had on hand, an ink pot. Seeing the residual blood pool at the bottom of the container, it struck me. I never truly understood why my predecessor used blood, only that they did. This will require more study. At this time, we still don't know who the predecessor mentioned here might be. Perhaps further study of the recovered accounts will tell us. Let us continue. The 9th day of the 9th month. Over the many years, my flesh has remained unblemished from the injuries sustained. Bones were repaired, sinews reconnected, blood replenished. No beast, manner of nature, or tool has been able to give me so much as a scar. But as I write this, my vision is halved. It seems the only thing able to hurt me is me. When my eye didn't heal, I felt the need to experiment, but I also felt fear. I hadn't experienced real bodily fear in years, only the abstract fear of my mind collapsing, but nonetheless, I grew worried that if I were to experiment with my remaining eye, I may lose my ability to see altogether. An eternal life filled with despair could only be worsened by a lack of vision. I resisted the urge to poke and prod for only so long. Soon enough, the whispers in the back of my mind began anew. What a wonderful story this might make. I only lasted so long before my hand reached for my tools. Interestingly, once I removed the wrappings around my face, I noted that the wound continued to bleed. There was no feeling of woozy discombobulation, as one would expect with blood loss. It was as if I had only just plucked my eye out a moment ago. More research is needed. Every account after this was not only written in a dialect that is so far unknown to us, it was also written in what we believe to be blood. We have learned many things from the writer's findings, though most is still being tested for validity, as it's unclear if these events have really taken place or the scrawled ravings of a madman. As for the end of our immortal writer, it is rumored that he has finally found rest. Considering that there was a lack of further accounts and no reports regarding his whereabouts, we have concluded that he must have found a way to end his eternal suffering, though, until we decipher the final accounts, we may never be sure. The tale of the immortal writer may be a fictitious story about the pursuit of knowledge and passion at the cost of one's life, or it may be the real-life account of a man driven to madness by the very thing that made him significant to history. What can be stated is that there are many legends related to a man who called himself the Immortal Writer. The only truth that we can be assured of is that there are books to be deciphered and accounts to be studied, all involving this prolific character. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the beautifully created piece that our apprentice has made in tribute to the Immortal Writer. She has captured the very soul of the ink pot that was recovered during our investigations. The images that accompany our readings are lovingly created to help visually enhance the stories we are telling. Our apprentice has only been with us for a few short months, but in that time has shown to be a talented artist who captures the very soul of every story they come across. By year's end, we hope to have a compiled book of their works available for the general public. The actual ink pot depicted in the image can be found amongst our display cases further into the estate. Please feel free to peruse our exhibits. I will remain here for any questions or inquiries regarding today's story. For those of you leaving, please remember to gather your belongings, and we thank you for attending Stitches and Stories with the Baker Estate and Archives. Have a pleasant evening.